Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the library. A special welcome to our in-person audience this evening, and also, of course, to all of you Zoomers out there who I can't see since I'm not in my office. I'm usually doing this on a laptop. But I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager at the library. That means I get to work with great partners like our speaker tonight to put together all the great programs we have here, the adult programs, across the whole range of topics and themes. It's a lot of fun, and we like doing it. We've been having in-person programs since September, and they've been growing in popularity and even in attendance. A couple weeks ago, we had a big art opening reception, well over 100 people with that on a Friday evening. The next one's on July 8th. The show that they're putting up in the next couple days. So Friday, July 8th in the evening at 6 o'clock. We also had a couple weeks ago the first Connecticut's own chamber music concert in 2.5 years with about 140-something people right in here watching that concert. So things are getting more normal as we go along. And I'm really glad that Mark was willing and able to come here tonight for the concluding lecture of this series.
Turns out all the roads are the same. It's more expensive to travel, but the roads are the same.
And I just want to thank again the Quigley family for their generous support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley, who was a regular attendee at most of our literature seminars over the years. So as before, with the questions, I can handle some from the folks in the Brubeck Room here. Also, you Zoomers at home, as in the last 3 weeks, use the Q&A button, and I'll look at those questions and relay them to Mark, either at the end or in the middle, however he wants to do that this time. And of course, as usual, Mark's always happy to answer questions that you can email him directly. I know many of you have been doing that over the last few weeks, and if anybody needs his email address, just let me know. He's always happy to answer those emails. A couple of quick program notes. Starting next Thursday, 10:30 in the morning, Judson Scruton is starting a 4-week series on the poetry of Robert Frost. Should be great. Judson's been doing these poetry seminar series with us for many years. And they're very popular, and Robert Frost, of course, is fantastic. And then we're going to have Mark back in October for 4 Thursdays, 7 in the evening. By then, we'll decide, is it all live, and is it all in person, is it part Zoom? We'll figure that out. And right now, we're working on the selection of novels that will go into that program. But you can put in pencil on your calendars 4 Thursdays in October for having Mark back. And with that introduction, which was too long, now I'll turn it over to Mark for tonight's program.
And I'll say again, and not formulaically, I'm very grateful for Michael to partner with me in putting together now these several 4-part series and have a kind of continuity. Most libraries are not willing to do that. That's not a criticism, because they want variety. And they worry about doing a whole year, for example, of American novels. So I'll say to the people who are elsewhere and watching remotely that I won't be looking up at the camera, because after many, many months of looking only at Michael and worse at me and not seeing faces, I'm going to be talking to those of you who I can see, and I know you're out there, the rest of you. So on my edition of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, there's a very tiny blurb on the cover from the New York Times, a remarkable book. And I hope if you had a chance to read it or reread it, you agree. This is a remarkable book, a first-time novel by a woman who wanted to be a musician, like Mick in the novel, got sidetracked, married a man who also wanted to be a writer, a man named McCullers. They had a deal that one of them would write while the other worked for gainful employment to support them, and they would alternate. And her success was so sudden and so strong, they didn't alternate. That led to a divorce, and that led to their marrying again. And in her lifetime, after the second divorce, She had several romantic sexual relationships with men, but she had a number of romantic unconsummated relationships with women. I say that because she described herself as an invert, that is, a male caught in a woman's body. And clearly part of what she's channeling in Mick, wanting to be a musician, feeling frustrated, not knowing exactly how she should handle her sexuality, there's a little bit of autobiography in the character of Mick. But I think one of the great achievements of the novel is it avoids being schematic. You can't say, oh, Biff is the this one, and Mick is the that one, and Dr. Copeland is that one, and especially that Jake is that one, or Singer. This is a book in which a man who can't speak is named Singer. He has a radio that he can't hear. People come to his home all the time to talk to him, and he can't hear. He writes letters to a dear friend who can't read. It's a wacky book. That's a literary term, by the way, wacky. And I think its wackiness strikes home in the second chapter. You may have noticed that the first section has 6 chapters, beginning and ending with Singer, John Singer, him and his friend, and the issue of the eventual illness and hospitalization. 4 chapters with the 4 protagonists in the order of Biff, then Mick, then Jake, then the doctor. And then we go back to Singer with his visitors. That's the first part. And it works as a kind of musical interlude, a solo, 4 parts of the harmony of those individual visitors, and then all of them together apart. And then there are 15 chapters, and then after the sudden suicide of Singer, there are 4 chapters in the single day, morning, afternoon, evening, night. The doctor, Jake, Mick, and Biff. You may not have noticed exactly the reverse order of the first part. If you're looking for literary devices, they're musical. It has a kind of motif. But the book is extraordinary in avoiding schemata, avoiding allegory. It'd be very easy to say, oh, Singer is a deaf mute who everyone gravitates towards. He must be some kind of wise man or some kind of genius. Oh, the doctor wants to improve race relations. He must be a kind of messiah figure. Oh, this girl clearly has something in common with the author. She's got to be a version of Carson McCullers. None of those things is true. Biff is probably the character who's come closest to a spiritual, religious, philosophical, expansive view of the world. He speaks first of the quartet, and he speaks last and is given an epiphany. Singer is an engraver, and so a kind of artist. And Mick wants to be a musician and composer, and so a kind of artist. But neither of them has a particularly artistic sensibility, in the sense that neither of them seems really interested in humanity generally or many other people individually. John Singer is smitten with his friend Spiros, and Mick is in love with music and just finds it transportive. But neither of them has the kind of broad sensibility you'd expect in an artist. But Biff does, the owner of this cafe that never closes. And one of the remarkable things in the book is in the first chapter in which we meet him, chapter 2, he says to his wife, "I like freaks." 1940. That's a pretty remarkable sentence in a novel for a character that's meant to be eventually normative and even admirable. I like freaks. And his wife, Alice, says to him, not surprising, you are a freak. That's not something you will find in Hemingway, Edith Wharton, Fitzgerald or Faulkner. You find it in Sherwood Anderson. When we did, in the last unit, the novel collection of stories as a novel, Winesburg, Ohio. The opening of that book is called The Book of the Grotesques, and it talks about how a writer imagined people who obsess about one particular thing so much that it distorts them, and they become grotesques. And Anders's entire book is an homage to the grotesque. He likes freaks. Carson McCullers said that she likes freaks. And when she was asked, why is it that Southern writers seem to particularly like to gravitate towards freaks? Some of you may have heard the expression, the Southern Gothic. Is there anyone who hasn't heard the phrase, the Southern Gothic? If you identify yourself, you'll learn. But if not, I'll assume you all know it. Everyone knows Southern Gothic. Okay, there'll be a quiz later. She wrote, when I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it's because we are still able to recognize one. And she's not being witty. The Southern Gothic arose out of the post-Civil War experience of the South trying to heal the trauma of the war. Whatever you feel about the politics, the history, the racism, you had a defeated people living on the soil in which they were beaten, having to deal often with their own legacy, the burden of the past, brutality, violence, physical maiming, living on the site of plantations destroyed, animals and people maimed. And part of the Southern Gothic is an attempt to try to make a kind of sense of the distortion of the human experience, including the human body, that comes from such a cataclysm, especially one that's civil, that is, family against family. In The Great Gatsby, you might consider that Gatsby is a kind of grotesque, someone who's been distorted by his obsession with Daisy to the exclusion of everything else. In The Sound of and the Fury, both 1920s, that is post-World War I, you have a deformed young man, no longer young, who has been castrated as a protection to the neighborhood children and girls, who is mentally deficient. In Absalom, 1936, a good deal later, Faulkner, again, Thomas Sutpin has a design of how he wants to live his life that becomes a blueprint and a kind of disaster. The Sun Also Rises, 1926, Hemingway has a man who's been maimed by a war wound and is a kind of grotesque. This is not my label. This is what critics and even these authors would say. And I'm sure many of you know the work of Flannery O'Connor, whose dates are almost identical to Carson McCullers. Carson McCullers is 1917 to 1967, and O'Connor was born 8 years later and died a few years earlier. But she is the grande dame of Southern Gothic, and she uses terms like the misfit and grotesque to talk about how evil and social isolation has distorted people. The key to the grotesque is it is something human that has been terribly altered or deformed. It's where we get the word monstrous. By the way, grotesque, you may not know, comes from the Italian word grotto, because in the cave grottos, people discovered paintings that showed combinations of animals and beasts that were so common among Greek myths. The idea of mushing together things in some kind of freakish way. And so grotto led to grotesque and so on. So what I want to say is you have a character who likes freaks, who by John Singer's reporting in his letter says is unlike the others because he doesn't hate and he watches and he thinks. They're all talkers. Biff is not a talker, although we get to be in his company at the end. John Singer seems to be central in the sense that he's the hub to which all these folks gravitate. But there's nothing central about him in terms of his message. He is a lonely, pained man. He experiences love not so much that cannot speak his name, but maybe he can't name himself, that he's not sure what it is. There's certainly something homoerotic about it. They love each other as men, but there's no suggestion that their love is actually consummated, and it makes that more interesting to think about the loneliness of this man who for 10 years had lived with someone who in his description is apparently unattractive and uncommunicative, can't read the letters that are written to him, but he's somehow in John Singer's blood. And it's not hard to imagine that the author of the novel is figuring herself at the center of the relations of the characters that she's created. So having said all that, there's another wave of grotesquerie after the Civil War that I hinted at by mentioning those post-World War I books. World War I introduced another kind of savagery and brutality. For the British, who were in the war longer and had the suffering closer to their shores, the trauma of the war led to the idea of the grotesque in literature. The British World War I poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and others, the horror of death by poison gas, the horror of maiming, weapons of mass destruction, people dying wounded in mud 5 feet away beyond the barbed wire, dying as they scream out and no one could do anything to them. There was a great sort of collected trauma in the First World War that led to some of the books I mentioned and a new kind of grotesquerie, that life is horrific because you see both what it was and what's missing. So it's not a new kind of person, it's a deformed or partial person. Can't reproduce, can't think clearly, can't hear, can't speak, and so on. So I will say that the book adds to this that it is being enacted on the very eve of the Second World War. It is September, late summer of 1939, when the novel ends. Biff hears that Hitler has some plan for Poland, and we know what that plan is. The war starts just a few weeks later, and although Carson McCullers, writing the book in 1939, publishing in 1940, doesn't know what was to come, she knows what's happening. And fascism, the intense setting of people one against the other, whether by class, labor unions, or race, Dr. Copeland, is in the very system of the American culture. And unlike Grapes of Wrath, where it's a family that's made representative, you have these people who are as far removed from a family as possible. Mick has a family, the doctor has a family, there are families, but the crisis is not presented as a family experience. It is these atomized, separated individuals, all of them in search of something, the restlessness that John Singer talks about. They're all looking for something that they don't get. After Singer's death, Copeland feels that there's a lot of work still to be done. Jake can't stay and is running from the law. Mick has decided that for some reason she's grown up and she's working in a real job and she can't get the music back. And Biff realizes that there's something terrible coming that fills him with valor and terror at the same time. And he gets the last lines in his musings at the end of the book. That's a hell of a book. Can I ask you by show of hands, this is something I can't do on the remote, how many of you have read it recently? So enough of you that I want to invite you in the way I always do about a third of the way through our talk. Would anyone like to say anything about their reaction to the book, whether you read it for a first time or more than once, or studied it maybe? Has anyone read it in an academic environment? Yeah. What level? College. Yeah. I don't think it shows up so much anymore. Would anyone like to comment about the book in any way? Your own reaction to the book, which you can't get wrong.
Okay, Mike, I'll start.
You inspired him, Michael. Give a man a microphone.
Only because I was not a recent reader of it, but especially in the context of the last 3 weeks, where it was pretty obvious to me why those books, especially Grapes of Wrath in particular, stand out, are great, are considered great, etc. Even based on your excellent introduction just now, I'm not sure why this book, good as it is, nevertheless makes it to the pantheon of greatness. So that's my reaction to it. It's very, very good, but I don't see it, in my own sense, on par with the other ones, Grapes of Wrath, etc.
Yeah. There's never a suggestion that there's anything called par in my teaching. I want to say you can always, this is no criticism of you, but you can always make a distinction between, well, this is great, but not quite as great as that. The good news is you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between them. It's not like, excuse me, sir? Yeah, thanks. It's not like Fahrenheit 451 where some novels are going to be kept and some are going to be gotten rid of. You can know them all. I think part of what makes it great is how remarkably different it is. You'd be hard-pressed to find a novel that is as odd in a striking sense. And you may not think of yourself as a freak, but you may. And many people do, and I'm not just talking about the obvious things in 2022 about trans people or other kinds of issues that would be odd to us back in 1940. I'm talking about just the idea of being different. How many families do you know where the people who live together and are devoted to each other are not married, not related, not in love, not sexually involved, but they are smitten with each other as committed members of a unit? That's a long, long list, and it happens all the time. And one of the things this novelist is trying to do, partly channeling her own life as an invert, as someone who suffered from rheumatic fever for much of her life, like Flannery O'Connor, isolated in her own illness, but very strong in her mind. Someone who thought, where is a representation in fiction of people like me? The argument of somebody like Nora Zeal Hurston is, where are books written about black women like me? That's a good thing to do. That was something that needed to be fixed and needs to be done more of. But there are also people who feel themselves absolutely disenfranchised from the American dream, and not because they're poor or they're a particular demographic or they live in the wrong part of the country, but because they are in need of something they're not getting. They're hunting in a lonely way for something that no one can give them. The remarkable thing about the deaf-mute is everybody thinks he gets them. You talk to someone who can't hear and can't talk back, what's not to like? They think of him as a wise man. You know the old jokes where someone goes to a psychiatrist and says something very revealing, and the psychiatrist just says, uh-huh, and the patient says, oh, I see, you think I have to stop doing that, right, doctor? Doctor didn't say anything, but they're just bouncing back. I think part of the book's greatness is in how different it is and how much it is mining something in the American psyche that gets lost in 1940, because there's going to be a lot of great World War II literature, a lot of great novels that are much more conventional and striking. I think this is a remarkable book. And so it culminates the 4 books we did of the 30s when you think about Call It Sleep being very much about a disenfranchised sensibility in the American landscape. Their eyes were watching God, the same thing. The Grapes of Wrath, all 3 of those tied very much to history and economics, politics and sociology. And then The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, which despite it having a labor organizer who's an alcoholic and not very efficient and always angry, and a doctor who is interested in race relations but feels he hasn't been successful, and a woman who represents some aspect of the author, deeper than any of those is that they're all people who are hurting for a connection. You hear in high school English courses that one of the great themes of 20th century literature is alienation. Remember, alienation is not just feeling foreign or out of place, it's feeling out of place where you belong. If you go to Yugoslavia and you feel out of place, that's right, it's Yugoslavia, you're not a citizen. But if you feel out of place in your family, in your school, in your neighborhood, that's alienation. It gets eroded into an overused theme because that's the nature of education. I'm sure I've been guilty of it in my teaching. Becomes a theme you write an essay about. But it is deeply troubling to the people who feel they don't belong where they are. And it's a new attempt to try to find what makes America, America, in this, again, wacky book. Wacky is a pretty serviceable word. Yes?
Well, I think alienation, though, is really up to the individual. I mean, if you feel alienated and you are different, it depends on your personality, because you can use that to your advantage. And I think a lot of people kind of play the game where they play dumb or...
In the novel?
I'm just saying in general, like people who feel alienated, some people don't feel alienated. They want people to think they're alienated, but they want to change things.
Yeah, I don't doubt that, but let's talk about the book.
Yeah.
Okay, have you read the book?
No, not yet.
Okay. So what you say may all be true, but it's not why I'm here tonight,
Okay.
to talk about alienation. I mean that the book, in the way it describes alienation as this longing, this isolation, one of the things that Biff says about the people, that John says about the people who come to the room to visit him. Remember, one day they all show up, never happened before, is that they're so busy and they're so restless. They're busy doing nothing. They're busy longing. They're busy not connecting. And as long as he's alive, the wheel has a hub. And when he dies, they fall apart. And again, not in a sentimental, conventional way. Nobody else kills themselves. Nobody else falls completely apart. But all of them are knocked off of balance because they've had this central glue who is a man who wasn't listening to what they were saying because he couldn't. Yeah.
Well, it's like that movie, with Peter Sellers, where he's a gardener and he'll say things and people think he's a genius, but he's really an idiot. I forget the name of the movie.
Being There?
Yeah.
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 Very similar.
Or The Stranger, Camus' The Stranger. It's all the same to me. I don't really care. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, as someone who grew up in the South of the 40s and 50s, I found the treatment of African Americans in this book extraordinary. And both in terms of their characterization and also the passionate anti-racism of Copeland, which you never heard expressed at the time there. And when the racism was so profound and pervasive, and yet these people obviously had adapted, and mostly, except for the exception of poor Willie.
And this is Georgia in the 1930s.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Let me ask you, do you know what Richard Wright said about this book?
No.
So I want to assure you, I've never met this man before. He's not a plant. Isn't that right, Uncle Ned?
No, yeah, that's right. I just happened to be here at your insistence.
Well, I'm happy to have you here, especially because you lead in. This was not planned, those of you watching at home. Richard Wright reviewed this novel when it came out and wrote, Richard Wright, native son, black boy, one of the most accepted black writers in his day. Native Son was a Book of the Month Club selection. He wrote, to me, the most impressive aspect of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter is the astonishing humanity that enables a white writer, for the first time in Southern fiction, to handle Negro characters with as much ease and justice as those of her own race. This cannot be accounted for stylistically or politically. It seems to stem from an attitude towards life, which enables Miss McCullers to rise above the pressures of her environment and embrace white and black humanity in one sweep of apprehension and tenderness. Apprehension in the sense of getting it. Apprehension in the term, not fear, comprehension, and tenderness. The person in the novel who is most interested in apprehending and being tender is Biff. He gets the last word. That's from Richard Wright at the time the novel came out. And I hope that partly answers your question. And I wasn't making a joke at your expense. I appreciate your saying that when you did. Otherwise, I would have had to just throw it in myself. So.
Well, I would say that maybe William Faulkner preceded McCullough in that regard.
Right, although there were many black writers who feel that as good as Faulkner was, it's very schematic in his books about a hierarchy between black and white. And she's a lot younger and a lot less experienced and probably a lot less learned at her age than he was at his age. But we don't have to make those comparisons. That's an amazing accolade, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that if other people have something to say, okay?
I just want to follow up on my comment before. Based on something you said, I'm just going to give you credit for this, okay? This was not a plant, just like you said, he was not a plant. I love your comment that these folks aren't alienated from the world at large, but they're rather alienated from places that they themselves actually belong.
Right.
That, to me, is a big idea. So I did not have that coming into the room tonight. And I see that theme as relatively unique for anything I've read before. So if that's one of the criteria for moving it up to the top level, I go for that. I love the way you phrased that, seriously.
Well, no, I appreciate that. I want to make it clear, I'm not interested in moving it. But yes, no, I get it. Right, top 40. This week, I had occasion to teach the excellent short story by Grace Paley, who, despite her name, is a Jewish American writer, a story she wrote called The Loudest Voice. Does anybody know that? In which she recalls back before her mother had died. She's writing this in her 30s. When she was in middle school or high school, the English teacher of a grade she's not in is putting on a Christmas pageant on the Lower East Side or somewhere in immigrant neighborhood New York, and wants her to be the narrator, which means she gets to say Christian things, including quoting the Messiah, on a Christmas pageant, because she has the loudest voice. And she's very proud, because one of the things she tells us in the story before she's offered that position is she lives in a loud neighborhood. You've been in immigrant neighborhoods where the separation between inside and outside is not always what it is in middle-class culture or quote-unquote American culture. And she says she will always be heard. When people tell her to quiet down, or when the noise in the street is too much, the inside chorus doesn't abate, the inside chorus, because she's well-adjusted. Mick is not well-adjusted, and part of her alienation is she can't get back to her inside room. Remember that? The inside room, the room of her aspiration, seems to be closed. John Singer doesn't have an inside room. He had Spiros until Spiros is taken away. Blunt has this kind of vague idea about labor movements that are compounded by, again, his alcoholism, his anger, in some cases his inefficiency, his being on the outs with the law for more than just his labor activities. Dr. Copeland is beset by the fact that there's so much to be done, he seems not to be succeeding. You want grotesquerie. The feet of his son are amputated because of how he was held up, suspended. Recently, a man in Hartford became paralyzed by falling in a van that had no seatbelts. He was African American. So, again, the novel treats so poignantly in a way that is not neat, that's not easy, that's not sentimental. One of the hardest things about writing yourself into a book, writing about the things you know, like her own frustration Carson McCullers about not becoming a musician. After she graduated high school, she was given money to go to New York City and enroll in Juilliard School of Music because she had studied piano since the age of 10. And she lost the money on the New York subway. And she was embarrassed to tell anyone, so she took various jobs as a dog walker, a waitress. She took classes at night. She eventually got good enough as a writer, taking classes eventually at night at Columbia and NYU, to get a literary agent and to do quite well. And she wrote a story that wasn't published at the time she wrote it, called The Wunderkind, about such a girl who's remarkable, who does see some of her talent come to fruition. It didn't happen for Carson McCullers. And to write about a girl who's like you but not like you, who doesn't get to fulfill what she thinks is her destiny quite yet because her family is poor and she has to work, and not to make it sentimental or bitter or self-serving. If any of you have ever worked on memoir or written stories, even if it's only in letter form to your children or your grandnieces or nieces and nephews, your grandchildren, you know how hard it is to get out of your own way, not to make yourself the hero of every story you tell, not to be sappy and sentimental, to maybe have a little bit of I like freaks thrown in for the mix. I think it's a remarkable accomplishment. First time novelist, she is 23. Is that right? No, that doesn't sound right. Yes, 23 when it's published. That's a remarkable thing. Other comments about your experience with the book? Yes.
I just couldn't get the title out of my head the whole time I was reading. It was just an example of a book whose title invaded my entire approach to the book. I can't remember that.
And are you aware that it comes from a poem?
No.
So you could look this up online, but the name of the poem is A Lonely Hunter. The author is Fiona McLeod, MC or MAC capital LEOD, and talks about the idea of the heart being a lonely hunter. Somebody in either her acquaintance or her publishing house suggested that title to Carson McCullers, who talked very much in her talking to her editors about what she hoped the book would do about people's hearts. So she wrote that the theme of her novel, and I think this was to one of her editors, is, quote, man's revolt against his own inner isolation and his urge to express himself as fully as is possible. Now, I want to say that even though that may be underlying a lot of the literature we've read so far, that's not what Fitzgerald's trying to do. That's not what Edith Wharton or Hemingway is trying to do. The writers of the 30s, the books that I've selected, are all writers trying to show something about humanity. In The House of Mirth, Lily Bart doesn't want to play the game she's playing. So she's alienated in that sense, but she's not really a grotesque. For one thing, she's beautiful. She might be more of a misfit, might be someone out of place. One of the characters says about her that her tragedy is that she hates the thing she's striving for. And in This Side of Paradise, if you remember Anthony Blaine, he also seems to be someone who, especially after his priest mentor dies, is a kind of misfit. But only in Winesburg, Ohio, do you get grotesques or freaks. And again, the author is very self-conscious about that, knows that the word is an unpleasant word, and now it's being mined again. It's not an accident that Biff uses that word positively. He says later on, I like cripples and people who are sick, partly because he's a charitable person. He has a lot to give. And the person who wrote those words, like Flannery O'Connor, was, in the parlance of the day, a cripple and sick and seen as a freak, and sometimes seen themselves as a freak. The TV show some years ago, Freaks and Geeks, is that notion of, goth students advertising their oddness as a kind of badge of glory. So, yeah, Michael.
Yeah, we have a comment question from the Zoom audience.
I'm doing Phil Donahue now. Caller, are you there?
So Susan says, why is the passage, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, the mission of Dr. Copeland?
Why is it?
Yeah. Well, we know, I think we know where that phrase comes
Yeah.
from. That's the sort of the fundamental credo of Marxism. What she's asking, why does that seem to be the mission of Dr. Copeland?
I want to say it's part of his mission, but what I think he's embracing is that Marxism in the ideal doesn't see race. And so if you're willing to get rid of capitalism, which many people, including a doctor who's an intellectual, he's a little bit too book smart for his own good, Dr. Copeland. But one good thing is that you don't see color. Richard Wright, when he leaves the South in Black Boy, one of the great memoirs in all of American literature, and comes north, he joins the American Communist Party because they didn't mind having Black people in the party. And he never met people who were anti-racism and Americans. He didn't care that they called themselves communists. He couldn't get over the fact that they were people who were Americans and anti-racism. That might be part of it. So to talk about style, listen to how this begins, the novel, chapter 1. In the town, there were two mutes, and they were always together. Early every morning, they would come out from the house where they lived and walk arm in arm down the street to work. The two friends were very different. The one who always steered the way was an obese and dreamy Greek. In the summer, he would come out wearing a yellow or green polo shirt, stuffed sloppily into his trousers in front and hanging loose behind. When it was colder, he wore over this a shapeless gray sweater. His face was oily and round with closed eyelids and lips that curved in a gentle, stupid smile. Calm down, he's taken, people. The other mute was tall, Laurel and Hardy. His eyes were quick, intelligent expression. He was always immaculate and very soberly dressed. We learned later on that there were two rooms, and there were straight, plain kitchen chairs for Singer and an overstuffed sofa for Spiros. The bedroom was furnished mainly with a large double bed covered with an eiderdown comforter for the big Greek and a narrow iron cot for Singer. It's like a fairy tale. They play chess, but only if the Greek gets the white pieces. White and black, round and tall. It's like something out of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Too big, too small, just right. That opening has a little bit of Winnie the Pooh about it, of these two companions. That's how the book starts, that kind of fable. This is how it ends. So Spiros has died. More importantly, Singer has died of suicide. And here's the last paragraphs of the novel. In the night of that long day that we hear from the quartet of visitors, now that a month before they buried Singer. And remember, Mick was the one who found him. The silence in the room was deep as the night itself. Biff stood transfixed, lost in his meditations. Then suddenly he felt a quickening in him. His heart turned and he leaned his back against the counter for support. For in a swift radiance of illumination, he saw a glimpse of human struggle and of valor. Remember, eve of the Second World War, of the endless fluid passage of humanity through endless time, and of those who labor and those who, one word, love. His soul expanded for a moment only, For in him he felt a warning, a shaft of terror. So valor and terror, and valor because there's terror coming that's going to require you to be brave. He saw that he was looking in his own face in the counterglass before him. It says between two worlds he was suspended. So we just see in the beginning, there's this guy over here and that guy over there. He does this, he does that. Now one person is suspended between two worlds. He saw that he was looking at his own face in the counterglass before him. Sweat glistened on his temples and his face was contorted. One eye was opened wider than the other. And remarkably, the left eye delved narrowly into the past, while the right gazed wide and affrighted into a future of blackness, error, and ruin. Like Janus, that looks both ways, you know that character from mythology? And he was suspended between radiance and darkness, between bitter irony and faith. Sharply, he turned away. Think about not just the change in style. This is nothing like the style of the paragraphs I just read to you. But think of the difference between having two caricatured characters, oily, fat, eating, slovenly, eats too much, Greek, and this immaculate, well-dressed, thin, tall man. But the idea that the split here is in a single individual, the most rounded individual in the novel. Louis, he called, Louis, Louis, but no one answers. If this were a movie, the last spoken word of the novel would be a call that doesn't get answered. Again, there was no answer. But Mother God, was he a sensible man or was he not? And how could this terror throttle him? This is him essentially talking to himself, but not out loud. Like this when he didn't even know what caused it. And would he just stand there like a jittery ninny, or would he pull himself together and be reasonable? For after all, he was a sensible man, or was he not? Biff wet his handkerchief beneath the water tap and patted his drawn, tense face. Somehow he remembered that the awning had not yet been raised. As he went to the door, his walk gained steadiness, and when at last he was inside again, he composed himself soberly to await the morning sun. Tomorrow is another day. Whatever you're going to do about facing this terror, you got to open up. You got to put the awning out. You got to do stuff. Any of you who have lived through personal or family crises know how therapeutic and positive it is to say, somebody's got to make dinner, right? We got to do this. We got to pay the bills. We got to walk the dog. We got to do stuff, kind of normalcy. You could not imagine two more different registers from the beginning that I read to you and this end. And the sense that they're on the edge of a precipice of darkness and terror, which you only had to be reading the papers in the 30s, the night of the long knives and Kristallnacht and all the things that the Nazi parties did well before 1939 to know where this is going. And the colors did. But to her credit, it's not essentially a political novel. It's not a novel fundamentally about race. It's broader than that. It's not a novel fundamentally about the labor movement, the way race, like Their Eyes Were Watching God, not about the labor movement, the way that clearly The Grapes of Wrath is. It's bigger and more existential than that, and good for her. I'll take more comments if you have them. That's essentially what I hope to convey in both choosing the book and preparing the comments I wanted to make tonight about it. If you haven't read it, I really do strongly recommend that you at least give it a try. And if you're put off by the first few chapters, why don't you read the last chapter of the novel out of sequence and see if that'll entice you to read the others.
Great.
Okay, great. I'm not ending early because there's wine. but there is wine, I want to say.
Well, thanks, Mark, again, for another great series, and we're looking forward to the one in October. It'll probably be thematically an extension beyond what we've been doing, working through the 20th century. I won't say anything more about it because we're still noodling around the idea, but we'll have it worked out, and you'll get a heads up email from me explaining it even well before it's officially on the calendar, so you can start thinking about it. And in many cases, I know people have been reading all these books all along, even though, a novel a week is not easy to pull off, and some of them are longer than others. This one was a good length, I think. Anyway, thanks for coming. People in the audience, please join us for a drink and a little snack and a little conversation. And for you folks in Zoom, thanks for watching. And I hope the next time we do one of these that some more of you will find your way into the library. Otherwise, enjoy the beautiful weather and have a nice evening, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Michael's going easy on me this year. He has often asked me to tell him the series and the books before the current series ends. And I think he's being kind to me because my vacation at Yale began at 5 o'clock today. And so he's giving me a little bit of a break, but I guarantee you before too long, I will get an email. What are you thinking of? And the good thing about Michael is that unlike I paid him this compliment, I mean it, many community, the programming librarians who I love and respect are not themselves readers. They're cultural people. They're very good at event planning and logistics, or they read their particular issue. But it's not uncommon for me to do a series at a library of 4 books, and the librarian have read not all of them or none of them. Michael not only reads them, he talks to me about them, and he also gives me advice about what I should or shouldn't keep on the list, which is not bad. So we'll work it out. Thank you, Michael.